The essay I'm going to talk about now is by James Baldwin, an essay published in 1953. It's an essay powerful beyond words. It's called Stranger in the Village. I had introduced James Baldwin in my book talk series as the author of an extraordinarily powerful, imaginative, polemical work called The Fire Next Time. This essay is a much lesser known work, but in some ways much wider in scope. That was also an essay, although it's published as a book. The Fire Next Time is a small book illustrating what I mentioned before in my introductory talk, that essays can be of various lengths. This essay is about Stranger in the Village, is about 10 pages long. And it begins with the following sentence: from all available evidence, no Black man had ever set foot in this tiny Swiss village before I came. I was told before arriving that I would probably be a sight for the village. I took this to mean that people of my complexion were rarely seen in Switzerland, and also that city people are always something of a sight outside of the city. It did not occur to me, possibly because I'm an American, that there could be people anywhere who had never seen a Negro. And he's saying that this is not because of the inaccessibility of this village. Yes, it's a small Swiss village. It's set high in the mountains. But as he points out, it's only 4 hours from Milan and 3 hours from Lausanne. And he points out that this village, which has in 1953, he's writing in 1953, has no movie house, no bank, no library, no theater, very few radios, one Jeep, one station wagon, and one typewriter, namely his, as that of a writer, right? But he says that nonetheless, this village actually attracts visitors and has attracted visitors for a long period of time. And the reason for that is that it has hot spring water, and cripples in particular come from other parts of Europe to this village to be healed, right? So what he does is he now describes his experiences in that village. And most of these experiences having to do with the fact that he is utterly, utterly alien to the people of this village. They can't comprehend what it means to look like a Black man. They can't comprehend the hair of a Black man. And so he says that, he would sit down somewhere and then children would come over to him and they would start putting their hands through his hair. If I sat in the sun for more than 5 minutes, some daring creature was certain to come along and gingerly put his fingers on my hair, as though he were afraid of an electric shock, or put his hand on my hand, astonished that the color did not rub off. In all of this, in which it must be conceded that there was a charm of genuine wonder, and in which there was certainly no element of intentional unkindness, there was yet no suggestion that I was a human. I was simply a living wonder. Right? And this, of course, reminded me of the fact that Europeans would often exhibit Black people, particularly Black people who were considered to be freaks, both men and women. And there is, for example, the very famous story of Ota Benga, Benga, a pygmy who was brought to the United States, right, and exhibited, usually in a cage, in places like Brooklyn, Manhattan, and elsewhere, right? So there is something of that in this. I was simply a living wonder. I was simply a living wonder. Right? And he also says that, so James Baldwin went to this village because there was a chalet there, and there was someone whom he knew. Right, this was the son of a woman who lived there, and this son was a friend of James Baldwin, and he needed a very quiet place that was relatively inexpensive, where he could just write, because that was his profession, that of a writer. And he says that you know that even weeks after he had been there, he continued to remain utterly a stranger to the people of that village. Now, this essay, however, becomes simply an occasion, right, for Baldwin to reflect on what it means to be a Black person in the world, and what it means for the world to no longer be white. The last sentence of this essay is, "This world is white no longer, and it will never be white again." And in the course of the intervening 6 or 7 pages, here I'm citing the last line, and I cited some material from the first 2 or 3 pages. In the intervening 6, 7, 8 pages, what he does is he really reflects upon the experience of a Black person. What is the relationship of a Black person to Western civilization? Why is it that the most illiterate person in this village can, in a way, lay claim, right, is related to, lay claim to, and is related to Dante, Shakespeare, Aeschylus, Da Vinci, Rembrandt, Racine? Right? The most illiterate person. The supposition is that this is all part of their inheritance, but it can never be part of his inheritance, because he is, after all, a Black person. A Black person. Right? And one of the things that Baldwin does so beautifully is he anticipates a possible rejoinder of sorts, or let's say a possible set of remarks where someone might say, well, I wonder if your experience of being the first Black person in a village that is entirely white is really very different than the experience of the first white people who landed in Africa. Let's say the first white explorer who arrived at a village that was 100% Black somewhere in the Congo or in Southern Africa, right? And so someone might say, well, how is Baldwin's experience different? And he anticipates this, and I'm going to simply read from what he says over there and on that particular note, because I think that this particular distinction that he draws is, I think, critically important between the particular manner in which white people lay claim to the whole world, including Africa, and even become custodians, self-appointed custodians of the heritage, the literature of Africa, right? But that this privilege can never really be the privilege of a Black person. He has to be allowed to enter the portals, the doors of Western civilization, right? So he says, I'm just looking for the passage over here. Yeah. So he's talking about the African slave, and he says he is unique among the Black men of the world in that his past was taken from him almost literally at one blow. One wonders what on earth the first slave found to say to the first dark child he bore. What an interesting, chilling thought. I'm told that they're Haitians able to trace their ancestry back to African kings, but any American Negro wishing to go back so far will find his journey through time abruptly attested by the signature on the bill of sale which served as the entrance paper for his ancestor. At the time, to say nothing of the circumstances of the enslavement of the captive Black man who was to become the American Negro, there was not the remotest possibility that he would ever take power from his master's hands. Okay? Right? So he starts to set up the discussion that I'm going to lead to, with which I'm going to conclude. whereas I pointed out, he anticipates the suggestion that that the experience of the first black man arriving in let's say a Swiss village, a village which is entirely white, may not be very different than the experience of a white man arriving in Africa, right? So he first discusses the character of slavery. What does it mean to really be black? And then he also has a whole set of comments, right? A whole set of comments where he points to the particular ways in which the idea of white supremacy poisoned really everything. Okay? The particular ways in which it poisoned everything. So here it is now. He says over here that Americans have made themselves notorious by the shrillness and the brutality which they have insisted on this idea, but they did not invent it. The idea of white supremacy, and it has escaped the world's notice that those very excesses of which Americans have been guilty imply a certain unprecedented uneasiness over the idea's life and power, if not indeed the idea's vitality. At the root of the American Negro problem is the necessity of the American white man to find a way of living with the Negro in order to be able to live with himself. Right? That this is the fundamental problem. That the white man here, his motive is to preserve his identity. The black man is now motivated really by the quest to establish an identity, to establish an identity. And this is the context in which he's going to then suggest that there's a fundamental difference, right? The fundamental difference between the black man arriving in a white village and the white man arriving in a black village. He has a different language of putting it as well. And that language, for example, is that, well, let's look at the historical record. And that the historical record is that the first black man arriving is not in a white village, is not viewed as human. Is not viewed as human. Certainly not viewed as divine. We know that it has been argued that the first white Europeans who arrived in the Americas, okay, were sometimes viewed as creatures who were divine. Right? But there is no sense of the black person being viewed. Wondrous here is not indicating some notion of divinity. What it is indicating is that this person is viewed as subhuman in a way, right? And of course, this is not the time and space to look at the whole historical record, right? The whole historical record. So of what happened when white people arrived in Africa. But here is the passage with which I will just read portions of it and over there. I thought of white men arriving for the first time in an African village, strangers there as I'm a stranger here, and tried to imagine the astounded populace touching their hair and marveling at the color of their skin. But there is a great difference between being the first white man to be seen by Africans and being the first black man to be seen by whites. The white man takes the astonishment as tribute, for he arrives to conquer and to convert the natives, whose inferiority in relation to himself is not even to be questioned. Whereas I, without a thought of conquest, find myself among a people whose culture controls me. has even a sense created me. People who have caused me more in anguish and rage than they will ever know, who yet do not even know of my existence. So powerful. And it is not a surprise that, as I've already indicated, that Baldwin, towards the very end, goes on to say that the world was white for several centuries, but it is white no longer, and it will never be white again. We could say never, but nonetheless, I think Baldwin is probably correct.